Welcome to episode 3 of the Study Smart series on procrastination and ways to avoid it. This is Samuel Rowe again from the Dennis Learning Center. Now today we'll be talking about identifying biases related to planning and decision making and how those affect our propensity to procrastinate. Remember that biases are perspectives that limit potential alternative perspectives and as such can place limitations and barricades around our way of thinking. Consequently, they can have some fairly dramatic effects. Now, the two that we'll be approaching today are the projection bias and temporal discounting. Let's start things out with projection bias. Projection bias is the imperfect ability of decision makers to project themselves into circumstances different than those in which they find themselves. Now, to begin to help us more fully understand this, I want to return for a minute to the example that we started with. We were talking about what procrastination is and the distinction between planning to do something and then actually doing it or the outcome. To understand projection bias, what we want to do is examine the difference in the emotional context between planning and outcome. What we know from our previous episode is that emotions are continually a factor in our decision-making process. What the projection bias is telling us is that we have a hard time discerning that there will be factors that affect emotion in our decisions that will change over time given alternate circumstances. So we're affected with an emotion now and we believe that that emotion will exist in the future. Understanding projection bias a little bit, let's go ahead and dissect the role it may have played given this first example of procrastination. Now, during the moment that you were planning not to procrastinate, you came up with the idea, say, to go to the gym. Your emotional influence may have been highly associated with interest in the gym. Maybe, a friend had posted on Facebook and saying something like, "Oh man, I'm just feeling so stoked," and you thought, "Oh man, going to the gym sounds like a really great idea." Maybe you just weighed yourself and thought, "Oh gosh, I'm gaining one too many pounds this holiday season. I need to get back in the gym." Or maybe you saw a celebrity or someone on an infomercial who just was in such great shape, you thought, "I need to be there. That's how I want to look." And so you had this emotional presence of inspiration sort of towards that idea, towards that plan. But what projection bias tells us is that we have a hard time realizing that while something created an emotional state that had us thinking about planning to go to the gym, there are many other experiences that may take place that will change our emotional state and alter the emotional level of influence present in our decision to follow through. Imagine if when you go to either go to the gym or do something else, you opened a Macy's catalog and, oh, what's worse, there happened to be a one-day sale. And even worse still, you flip to page 29 and there's this perfect outfit and you're like, "Oh, I'm going to look great in this. I have to go shopping." And your conclusion becomes, forget the gym, right? Projection bias is the phenomenon by which we don't see this coming. We are influenced to create the plan and believe that whatever inspired us to create that plan will be emotionally present in the future. Let's look at another example. Let's say, because this has happened to me before and I'm sure has happened to you, that you get an assignment in class and you like and respect your teacher. Not only that, but you're interested in the subject matter. Your immediate conclusion is that you'll work on this assignment later without the delay. Only you get home and similar to finding an open Macy's catalog, you remember that your favorite show is going to be on. So what ends up happening? You push the assignment into the mysterious land of delay and you watch your show. In this case, projection bias prevented planning from including the potential that we'd be exposed to a more powerful emotional influence later on. And so we plan and we expect for emotions to stay consistent with where they were, but they don't. And we don't plan for that effectively. Let's look at a really interesting example in research. Behavioral economist Daniel Reed and colleagues have worked with decision making for a while and did a fairly interesting piece of research on projection bias. In fact, by answering this simple question, which snack you would like to have for lunch 1 week from now, you can actually participate in the first phase of the experiment. So think about it. Between an apple or chocolate, which snack would you prefer to receive 1 week from today for lunch? My guess is that most watching will choose the apple, and that's because rationally we have a desire to be healthy, and we know that over time, eating an apple more consistently than chocolate for lunch is going to be better for us. Well, what they did is have people go through two phases of snack choice. In the one case, they asked people to plan between these two snacks 1 week in advance. And when they were planning what to have, the percentages were as follows. About 74% of people said, I'll take the apple. Only about 26% planned to be unhealthy. In the second phase of the experiment, they went to the same group of people and asked them, rather than a week prior to lunch, but during lunch, which snack would they like to have in this very moment. They refused to remind them which snack they'd actually chosen a week prior and forced them simply to choose now, which would you prefer. The results were pretty humorous. The same percentage of people who'd planned to eat the apple now chose chocolate, with only 30% holding out for the apple. Again, they were unable to predict that at the moment they were eating, they would be exposed to a different set of preferences and were now hungrier and closer to the treat. The emotional pull of the alternative became dominant. So that's projection bias, the fact that we are sensationally unaware of future emotional states when we plan. Now let's talk about temporal discounting, because the two of these often work together and both contribute to procrastination. The principle of temporal discounting can be summed up through the combination of the following two quotes. That is, that the objective importance of a behavioral alternative is largely a function of the perceived reward associated with it, and that given two similar rewards, people show a preference for one that arrives sooner rather than later. Essentially what this means is that we are emotionally influenced in decision making by the perceived reward we associate with decision alternatives. But the perception of those alternatives is changed depending on how soon in time they arrive. Let's look at a question that may help demonstrate this effect. What would you prefer from the two alternative rewards? To have $100 today, or to be given $110 in a month? The majority of listeners will likely respond that they would prefer the $100 today. It feels more relevant, more concrete, and more emotionally important. Now consider the difference between this choice and the following. Would you prefer $100 in 1 year from today, or $110 in 1 year and a month? The majority would now likely prefer the latter choice, given that a month isn't much longer to wait anyhow. But in the scheme of delay from one reward to the next, this and the former choice are the same, only separated by a year. It's the effect that year has on our perception that brings to light this principle of temporal discounting. Even if you were someone who preferred to wait for the $10 in this case, you can probably feel a difference emotionally between the consideration of each choice, in the sense that the choice for 1 year from now simply seemed much less important. This is that connection between our emotions and time that temporal discounting is referring to. And it can be loosely represented by the following graph. So from to heck yeah, between sooner or later, the rewards would fall something like this. Win today, win in a month, win in a year and a month. You should be able to see now how the second choice not only seems less important because the associated reward with either choice is lower, but there's a much smaller difference between the choice for $100 or $110, and so the decision to wait is simpler. You're deciding between two more equal value judgments. This is partly why we can seemingly plan to do the smart thing, study, read that book, save money, while simultaneously failing to do so. Because planning for the future is less connected to the ever-varying emotional context of the present moment. Think of the difference in rewards between the apple and candy bar. They both have a short-term and long-term effect. Taste is their short-term effect, and health is their long-term effect. The apple's short-term reward doesn't compare with the chocolates, and so when deciding immediately, the chocolate wins out. But when deciding for the future, the long-term effect of greater health is able to be given higher consideration, and so the apple wins out. So not only are we terrible at predicting that we'll be exposed to all kinds of varying emotional contexts in the future, but when we get there, whatever provides the most immediate reward likely becomes the preference. As usual, let's follow up with an example from research. Again, Dr. Daniel Reed demonstrates to us the importance of time in decision making with this research. Participants each chose 3 movies to be watched, on 3 different days, and these participants were separated into 2 conditions. In one condition, each movie was chosen that day it was to be watched. So a participant would choose a movie, go home to watch it, wait a day or two, come in, choose a movie, and repeat until they had watched 3 separate movies. Now, in another condition, participants took one evening to choose 3 movies that would be watched and spread out over those 3 days. So they would pick one to be watched for that night, they would pick another one to be watched in a few days, and another to be watched even a few days after that. So in the one case, we're picking a movie, watching it, waiting a few days, picking a movie, watching it, and in another, we're picking 3 movies, but we're watching one now, one later, and another even later. What the participants didn't realize is that the movies were separated into 2 categories. Highbrow movies, consisting of foreign films, films that have won awards or documentaries, and lowbrow movies, those with lots of action or humor. What the researchers wanted to know is would participants choose differently between these 2 categories depending on whether they chose the day they watched or several days before they watched. What I really want to make clear is that decisions we make about a future time are subject to less emotion and more rational influence. However, when the time arrives to enforce the decision, we are back in the present moment and emotion is now stronger. So the results sort of follow suit with this claim. Participants chose a movie to be watched that evening. The percentage choosing lowbrow versus highbrow was as follows. Day 1, highbrow 42%, lowbrow 58%. Day 2, we have 53% of people choosing lowbrow, 47% choosing highbrow, and day 3, we have about 56% choosing lowbrow and 44% choosing highbrow. These are all pretty relative, as you would expect, because in each one of these decisions, they're choosing a movie and watching it that evening. Now, when participants had to plan their movie watching and choose one for that night, one for the next day, and one for the next, their choices differed. Day 1 should look familiar, nothing too out of the ordinary. We have 56% lowbrow, 44% high. Alright, day 2, we're starting to see a change, 37% low, 63% high. And day 3, wow, 29% low, 71% high. If you have a Netflix queue, this might look familiar to you, with all the movies that your cinema-loving friend recommended to you sitting at the back of the list, and all those comedies you swore weren't worth watching actually being watched. What does this mean, exactly? Does this mean we don't know ourselves? That these people are only kidding themselves to think they wanted to watch these documentaries in the first place? Or are we only kidding ourselves to say that we want to do well in our academic lives? I don't think so. What this does demonstrate, however, is the strong role that the emotions we experience in the moment play on our decision making, our high emotional value for the things that reward us sooner, and our natural propensity not to realize that this difference exists. So now let's look at an example from our academic life. Given what we now know about how we are most motivated, that immediate rewards are given the most emotional weight, and that behaviors are deemed more important by the reward associated with them, what can we take from this in terms of how it helps explain why we procrastinate in a given situation? This scale is what I refer to as the scale of reward, and it can just help us to think more intuitively about the likelihood of one decision happening over another. So take a scenario in which you've procrastinated and start to build each side from the distraction side to what you had intended to do. What are some of the things that could distract you in that situation? Frequently, answers are technology related, and you'll find people where, there was show was on, as we said earlier, maybe Facebook, you're texting somebody, Pinterest, if that's your thing, or Reddit. These all produce a lot of weight on the scale of reward because they all give you immediate gratification. And from temporal discounting, that something which rewards us sooner is given more consideration. They also don't just reward us sooner, but they reward us frequently, and so they condition a sense of positive affect toward even just opening or perhaps thinking about opening them. So now let's look at the intended act and what would create an associated reward in that column. Maybe you needed to make flashcards or write an essay, read a textbook, do a lab report, regardless of which it was. How do they compare in terms of how much emotional reward they create for this scale? Not that well. Typically, These are assignments which aren't graded for days. Oftentimes we procrastinate on these tasks because they don't start becoming perceived as being associated with enough reward to overcome that of the distractions column until that reward is granted immediately upon working on the task, because you realize, well, I either begin or I fail. A major flaw with how we usually plan to procrastinate or not to procrastinate is that we ignore this scale. We don't consider this emotional weight, but instead we rely on willpower to produce more weight in the intention side, which is necessary, but if it's your only consideration, it will weaken very quickly. Our ability to resist procrastination will strengthen when we learn to lower the weight on the distraction side and to raise the weight on the intention side, manipulating the emotional context as we plan. That about wraps it up for today's Study Smart episode of Procrastination and Ways to Avoid It. We've been talking about biases as they relate to planning and a sense of reward. Check out our next episode, where we'll transition into taking some of what we've learned in the previous episodes and begin to apply it to solutions for effective planning and follow through with living the academic life that we intend. Thank you for watching. This has been Samuel Rowe with the Dennis Learning Center, reminding you to study smart.